With us today, to my immediate left and your right, is Richard Edelman, our president and CEO, and one of the world's foremost experts on trust, amongst other things. Only a few short weeks ago, he unveiled the results of our 11th annual Global Trust Barometer at the World Economic Forum in Davos. We're delighted to have him here live this year to opine on the data.
So how did we get into this trust barometer business? Well, it actually started with the battle in Seattle because we were very curious about NGOs and why they were blowing up stores during the World Trade Organization. And so we did our first study a decade ago and found that, in fact, NGOs are very important in global governance. And then this small company called Enron went bust and Global Crossing, and we figured, this doesn't have to be a one-year kind of gig. With all these trust problems, we ought to just keep focusing on the matter. So what happened in the last year that was particularly relevant to trust? Well, we had 5 big crises in the United States. If you think about it, they were all leading institutions in their categories. The most important statistic this year of all in our study, I think, is the across-the-board decline of trust in institutions in the United States. And these are big numbers. And they're consequential because they're an actual turn in fortune. If you think about it, that media is only trusted by 27% of Americans is a continuation of a 10-year slide for media. If you look at government at 40% trust, we're at a number that is equivalent to the low point of the Bush administration, again, throughout that 00 to 08. Trust in business is at its low point, except for 2009. There was that horrible moment. But business trust is very low, and even NGO trust sank this year. So Americans are just irritated and irritable.
First, we welcome Daniel Diermeier, Dr. Daniel Diermeier, IBM Professor of Regulation and Competitive Practice, as well as a Professor of Managerial Economics and Decision Sciences at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, and at the university's Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences, he's a political science professor. Gene Cummings, sitting directly next to Richard, is the assistant managing editor of Enterprise at Politico, which has truly become must-reading for all of us. There's no question about it. She's become a stealthy/detective tracking money and politics, a stealthy reporter/detective. For political buffs, Bob Shrum, all the way to my very far left, your right, needs little introduction. He's among the best-known political consultants and has worked on campaigns for the most familiar Democratic names over the past 40 years, Ted Kennedy, Al Gore, John Kerry, George McGovern, and I believe, Bob, Jimmy Carter for around 9 days, from what I understand. And we're delighted to have Bob here. He's been a senior counselor in our Washington, D.C. office for the past 2 years. And you had a fascinating column on February 7th, and it was apropos to President Obama's speech to the U.S. Chamber. And in that speech, he basically addressed his expectations of business. At some points in time, he wagged his finger. At other points in time, it seemed like he extended an olive branch. And it really was a discussion about how government and business needs to partner to tackle tough problems right now that we're facing. So let's start with your point of view on that column that you penned, and we'll start from there.
Well, I think where it's relevant to our discussion today is the statistic that Richard mentioned, in that government and business are in tandem in these trust polls. There is a codependency right now that the public sees between the business community and the government, despite all the fighting that goes on between the two of them. But with the bailouts, with TARP, I mean, U.S. taxpayers now own companies. So the two sectors are actually linked, and that is demonstrated in your poll results as well. And the president emphasized that codependency in that speech to the U.S. Chamber. The point he was trying to make was not just to extend an olive branch, but to motivate the business community to, as he said, get in the game. And I think it's pretty clear that the White House believes that their recovery can't come fast enough for them or the business community if the business community doesn't get more involved in job creation.
Richard, I think this is some of the most important data that I see each year about politics or business, and people ought to pay a lot of attention to it. I think this year's data are the midterm elections of the Trust Barometer. At most fundamentally, I think they're a referendum on the economy. And you see government and business going in tandem. For government, a year ago, people thought the recovery was on its way much more rapidly than it's come about. We live in an impatient era, and there's one other factor. The crash really happened just before Obama became president. So unlike Franklin Roosevelt, who came into office after 3 years of depression, and people said, well, it's going to take a while to fix this, they really wanted Obama to fix it very quickly. And that hasn't happened, although the right track numbers are beginning to tick up now, and his own numbers are beginning to tick up. The business piece of this was fed first, I think, by blaming business for a lot of the economic problems, the banks and financial services especially. I agree on the bonuses, by the way. They wouldn't care what the bonuses were if they thought the banks were doing a job for them and for society. And the banks have suffered a second problem, which is this drumbeat that's gone on, particularly in the New York Times, but everywhere, about closing out mortgages and throwing people out of their houses, and they don't even have the paper that prove that they actually hold the mortgage. That's a real reputational problem. And I think the reason that we've seen them in tandem the last few years is because they're both responsible for the economy.
So, first question. The report shows only 1/4 of survey respondents trust media. What is the trust like in social media? So actually, Richard, I'll start with you on that.
So, hello? Okay. So, interestingly, if you sort of do the rank order, mainstream media brands are highest, and social media would be about 1/4 as much. But I think that underestimates the power in two ways. One is the reflective power of social media, meaning Alan Murray of the Wall Street Journal, when he comes to work in the morning on train from Greenwich, told me that he reads his Twitter feed, and he has 100 people who he respects, and he looks at the stories that he has to see for the day. So the head of the Wall Street Journal, WSJ.com, is using Twitter as his primary source, A. B, in the 25s to 34s, it is about 3x that number. So let's look at it by age group, and let's look at it on influencers. Social media is hugely, hugely important. So we have to play aggressively in that game if we're looking for our clients.
Final question, or exit question, if you will. Is there a line that should not be crossed when it comes to being transparent to drive reputation? Dan, I'm going to start with you on this.
I think there is sometimes a misunderstanding between transparency and full disclosure. I think people sometimes think that in order to be transparent, they really have to disclose everything, and I don't think that's true. I think that you have cases of privacy where people fully understand that you do not have to disclose everything fully. The key point, I think, where transparency gets undermined when your audience believes that you're willfully withholding some information that's critically important to them.
In terms of transparency in the media, this is something that Politico has actually tried to focus on because of the general mistrust. So what we try to do when circumstances require it is if we screw up, we do a story about how we screwed up. And we don't wait for an ombudsman who's going to weigh in a week later after having to pry out information from people. In 2008, early when Elizabeth Edwards had her cancer return and people learned of that, we were awaiting to find out what John Edwards was going to do. And we have a very, very good reporter who got from a very, very good source the news that Edwards was going to quit. We posted that in a blog, not a news story. We put it in a blog. Within a minute and a half, we pulled the thing down because we got the incoming. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, don't do it. So we pulled it down and ran a correction on the blog. Now, we were criticized like crazy because a lot of the other media wanted to kill us in the crib. What they didn't admit was once we put it up, AP did, and CNN did, and others did as well. They just pulled theirs down. They didn't do corrections. So what we did was we wrote the next day 20 inches of how that happened and the decision-making inside Politico, some of which in hindsight we saw was wrong.
The anecdote I'll leave you with is my wife's a big environmentalist, and so I hear all the time about companies I should or shouldn't be working for and all this stuff. And so her latest hobby horse is the drilling in shale in Pennsylvania and upstate New York for natural gas and how the water tables are being ruined. And so I asked somebody in the energy business, so what goes into the shale? What are you putting in there? They said, surfactants. I said, well, what is that like, soap? And they said, yeah, it's soap. And I said, well, then why don't you just say it's soap? And you know that you're going to take the soap and you're going to clean it up and take it out and make the water okay. And they said, but Halliburton won't allow us to do that because it's their special formula. So let's use those words. Halliburton, special formula, surfactants. That's a guaranteed winner. So my model on all this is it's soap. It's producing natural gas that's going to reduce our reliance on foreign energy, and we're going to remediate it. And that's the new normal.